have you talk a bit about your own work. When you started publishing, your work was more considered part of the new wave of science fiction. During the 90s and since then, it's been more associated with new weird. So we would love to hear, how do you place yourself between these currents? And do you think that those labels are useful for thinking about your work?
It's an interesting distinction between the new wave and the weird, or the new weird, but I'm not sure it's entirely historically relevant in my case. When I began as a science fiction writer, I was like 20 years old, and my interest was in the UK and American science fiction magazines of the time, and the most interesting stuff that was going on at that time was in the new wave. All the great new wave writers had already written most of their best work, including, I think, Ballard, to be frank. And that's what fascinated me, and that was the medium that I was interested in using to express myself. 10 years later, say by 1975, 76, I had begun to find that limiting, because the new wave it did not turn out to be an explosion into freedom, as it were, as far as I was concerned, and there were elements of writing that we did not consider to be acceptable, and suddenly I began to be interested in those unacceptable areas of say, experience that you might write about, or I began to be interested in ways that you might write that were unacceptable to the new wave. And so for me, around the mid-70s, I was consciously looking for new ways to do things. And that sent me into a real interest in early modernism, proto-modernism, and at the same time, in a sense, in an almost opposite direction, a growing interest in something that was brand new at that time, which was postmodernism. At the same time, I was trying to educate myself in politics and in the new European post-structuralism. All this came together with, I'd always been interested in horror fiction as well as science fiction, and I'd obviously always been interested in mainstream fiction, literary fiction, as well as those two things. And I sat there in about 1976 and I thought, what is integral to all these four different fields? What if you swept stuff out, what would remain in common? Furthermore, what would happen if you tried to write a science fiction story without any science fiction in it? What would happen if you tried to write a horror story without any horror in it, for instance? And I sat there for a bit and I thought, well, the only way to find out is to try and do it. And at that moment, I started to write the weird. That was my way into the weird. I was obsessed with writers like Arthur Machen, H.P. Lovecraft, those kinds, Robert W. Chambers, those kinds of writers. But at the same time, I just wanted to see what would happen if you took out the most obvious elements and simply wrote stories. What would you arrive at? What would you end up with? And what you end up with is what I began to do then. We didn't start calling that the weird or the new weird until the 2000s, which was some years later, really. So my relationship to the question that you've just asked is quite complex. And now I'm just me. Now what I look for is to write an M. John Harrison. because that's what I'm best at, basically.
So writing, the rational mind usually comes after intuition or just trying to work through whatever you're doing, maybe not so methodically. And do these roles change sometimes, or is the writing process more intuitive or more rational?
You can't begin with the rational. In fact, you mustn't begin rationally. I always make two decisions. The very first decision is what form or structure will you be breaking when you write this? And then the next thing is where questions of plot and characterization and background, where all the normal ideas about fiction, they will come in, and they are subject solely to intuition. They're subject solely, there's no rationality involved at all. What is telling you to write this story? Where it's coming from, you don't want to know. You really don't want to know, because if you find out, you'll spoil it. If you find out where it's coming from, deep down inside your head, you will rationalize it. And I absolutely hate rationalization of any sort. My idea is, I know it's old-fashioned to talk about the unconscious, but my idea would be to let the unconscious speak, if you possibly could. So to start with, you make a very rational decision about form, and then you begin to make irrational decisions. And then finally, when you have something to work with as a result of that process, you can begin to operate rational procedures again. And those will be to do with aesthetics and form again. At that point, I think, so in a way you might say that you get your ideas irrationally, and then you use rationality to structure them. But I think that would be oversimplification.